Okay, so this live is going to be focusing on how to use and how to employ metaphor. Metaphor is an absolutely amazing literary choice that you can make, primarily because it ensures that you can transport your audience to an entirely different realm. You might be asking yourself, okay, Charlotte, how can one literary technique do that? Okay. But when we have a think about what metaphors do, what their function is, you'll see they actually form the basis of pretty much every important writer that you've read, primarily within, like, say, Shakespeare. Shakespeare loves them, okay, which is saying something. But anything from the medieval period as well, anything in Old English and anything in the 1800s as well, they absolutely loved metaphor, and there's a reason. So I made a very cool PowerPoint slide deck. That's right, I spent some time on that, and I'm going to see if I can share it with you now. Substack promised me it could, so let's see if this works. Okay, beautiful, that worked. All right, so let me quickly put on the little present. Oh, so aesthetically pleasing. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do, you're going to see there's going to be 4 sections. And the idea of these series, by the way, just as a side note, is to make literary devices and understanding literary techniques really easy, accessible, and employable. Okay, I'm not one for thinking that, good writing should and techniques and studies should be behind academic closed doors. I think everybody should have access to an understanding of it and enjoy using them. That's part of the beauty. I had a really wonderful lecturer, and I think I might have said this before, in music, who used to get me in trouble for going against musical rules all the time without always understanding what the musical rule I was going against was. So the idea with this one is much like my music teacher used to force me to do: learn your scales, learn your arpeggios, so learn your metaphors, learn your similes, learn your vignettes, learn your syntax. And then after that, if you love postmodernism or you love playing around with them, the techniques that is, then you have that freedom of expression, you have that joy and creativity. So as you can see here, we're going to do 4 things, very, very straightforward, simple. We're going to define what the metaphor is. Most of you will probably already know what that is, but we're just going to go into depth about what a metaphor actually is. Then I'm going to read you some examples. Oh, that's my alarm. Would have been a bit late for me to wake up then. So examples. Then we've got an explain. So in that explanation section, after I've read some examples for you, I'm going to go through and make sure that you feel really confident understanding why they were good examples. We've got people like Emily Dickinson, Sylvia Plath, all the greats. And then we've got important. So why it's actually worth using this technique and why you can feel confident using it afterwards. So without further ado, first one. Now, I've put a really boring dictionary definition in here just so we've got it, okay? Figure of speech in which a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest some sort of analogy. Cool. Now, let's actually think about what that's doing. So underneath, I've done my own little definition. So metaphors create a bridge between 2 worlds. So you've got the real world that you're describing of the text, okay? Say you're in a landscape, a beach or a forest, okay? You've got that real world, and then you've got the imagined or the experiential events of that world. So say, for example, I'll use a very, very basic one. Let's say your character's crying, right? Then maybe the way they're interacting with the world of the forest is very different to, say, somebody that's happy and joyous. Maybe they just, fell in love or had a really positive experience. So the idea is that the metaphor is going to bridge the real with the imagined or with the figurative, something that's not physically there, but something that's psychologically or emotionally present in that character's experiences. Metaphors, for that reason, create that tactility. It's almost like you can feel like you're there with the character. You don't have that separation between you being on this side of the page and the character being in the book itself. So there's that excellent kind of interplay between real and unreal. It's also you hear this all the time, whether it's Stephen King or, Margaret Atwood, whoever it is, show don't tell, right? They love that phrase. Now, there is a bit of a debate as to how much showing you should do as to how much telling needs to be done. But there is a really key point to take away here, that if you can command when you're going to show and when you're going to tell, it's going to make you a really good writer, because that means you're in control, you're in command of what you're doing. So that's what a metaphor is, and that's what it's doing. I found this really awesome article that described psychologically how metaphors work in the brain. So I put a link to this article at the end of the slideshow, so you can go check it out if you want. It's quite long, so I just got a couple of paragraphs that are really interesting. And essentially what this is going to do is provide a psychological definition of what metaphors do. So in this 2011 study, we're just going to read some of it now, half of the participants read about a crime-ridden city where the criminal element was described as a beast preying upon innocent citizens, an animal metaphor. Okay, it's also called, if you want the fancy term, zoomorphism. Okay, zoomorphism is when you're using metaphors but with a lot of animal imagery. A separate group read essentially the same description of the city, only it described the criminal element as a disease that plagued the town, a disease metaphor. Later, when asked how to solve the crime issue, those who read the animal metaphor suggested control strategies, increasing police presence, imposing stricter penalties, etc. Those who read the disease metaphor instead suggested diagnostic or treatment strategies, seeking out the primary cause of the crime wave, bolstering the economy. So this study shows that the changing of the metaphors themselves actually altered the way readers engage with the crime issue. If it was a beast, it needed to be controlled. If it was a disease, it needed to be treated. So writers can actually use metaphors to strategically control reader perception. So fascinating, right? The way your reader's engaging with that imagined or figurative outline of reality is completely orientating their experience of it. So if you want to read a really cool text called The Plague by Camus, a lot of people probably already read that one, but it's wonderful because it's seen as an allegory. The disease is an allegory for war. That's how a lot of people have read that text. But when you start to see this little town described in the text as one completely plagued by this disease-ridden, really terrifying, very contagious virus, and then you start to realize, oh, hang on, Camus was actually talking about a World War II incident. It creates a very, very different orientation, a very different perspective on a complex theme that you would otherwise probably, engage with in a very different way. So that's our definitions of metaphors and what they can do. Now I'm going to read you a few examples and we're going to quickly deconstruct it afterwards. So this first one, I've tried to grab extracts, by the way, from, really classically brilliant poets or short stories. Usually I find poetry is a very quick way of understanding metaphor and its impact because the metaphor has to be condensed. It can't be expanded out over a long time period, which is great. Extended metaphors, I'll cover them later, are amazing. They're good as well. But when we're feeling really confident in our exploration of metaphor, that's when we go into the extended content. So, Hope is the Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So that's a really, really gorgeous bit, positive use of animal imagery within metaphor. She's not saying hope is like a bird, okay, or like a thing with feathers. We're getting it is something. So when you're looking at metaphors, you can always ask yourself, can the noun literally do the thing the verb is commanding it to do? So hope cannot literally be a thing with feathers. Cool. That means when we've asked ourselves that question and the answer is no, it's most likely going to be a metaphor because we're taking an experience, an event, a noun, and we're turning it into something it's not. Okay, but the thing that it's not is usually something that we've all felt it to be. So that's the important thing. The metaphor, we always hear very kind of logistical, which I've probably given at some point here, a very logistical or, logos possessed definition or explanation of metaphor. But when we look at what metaphor is doing, it's creating an incredibly emotive landscape. So it's creating pathos. It's creating some sort of vision, some sort of dreamed vision of what that experience is, either spiritually or psychologically or emotionally. So hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Okay, so she's taken that metaphor and then she's strung it into the next line. And what you'll notice is she's then going to string it into every other line as well. That's when it starts to become a bit more of an extended metaphor rather than just, a metaphor in 1 or 2 sentences. What's the impact of that? Well, it almost shakes your psyche. Okay, it's shaking your brain and it's going, hey, you think you know what hope is? Okay, no, it's not whatever your definition is. It's actually this completely sublime experience, which I'm going to extricate out of your preconceived perceptions of reality, and I'm going to throw it into a reality of my own defining. So metaphors are so powerful because you can redefine an experience in relation to how you want it defined in your creative piece or how you want it defined in your poem. Emily Dickinson, by saying it's a thing with feathers, she's not saying, oh, hope is, completely lost in our world, in our industrial world, in our urban decay. She's not saying anything like that, which is a very, very common thing of her time period, to be a bit forlorn. But this transatlantic poet is deciding to see it in a completely new light, and she's introducing that to us with beautiful imagery created by metaphor. So there's a lot of other things in this poem, but we're going to move on because that's the key bit that we want to look at for metaphor there. Okay, then we've got the lovely bard himself. Shakespeare uses an excessive amount of metaphor, and you might think, oh gosh, Shakespeare's so hard to understand, because he can be very difficult to understand. And we tend to misconceive that we think it's the language, right? It's the early modern English, thy, thine, archaic second person pronoun, all those fancy words that he's using. But usually it's not actually the words themselves, it's the amount of metaphor the man uses that results in a complexity of understanding. Okay, so if we have a look at this and I should give some context actually. So Othello, if you haven't read it or you haven't watched it, brilliant play, and it's got perhaps one of the most excellent villains, vice figures. He's kind of personification of the devil. His name's Iago, and he's very, very jealous of Othello because he got a promotion. Yes, a promotion. I know, pathetic, but that's kind of the point, right? It's very pathetic. He gets jealous about this. He gets a promotion within the army. And then Iago goes on a little rampage to try and deter his success. Okay. In this section, Act 3, Scene 3, this is the bit where he's essentially tricked Othello into thinking that or is starting to really convince Othello that Othello's wife, Desdemona, is having an affair. Now, Othello gets really jealous of Cassio, the man that is purportedly having this affair. But it's ironic because Iago is jealous of Othello, that's why he's doing everything. And then Othello is jealous of Cassio, and that's why he's doing everything, right? The key motivator, that sin, that vice of envy. And this section is beautifully ironic. It's got a lot of dramatic irony in there because Iago's saying to Othello, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. That cuckold lives in bliss who, certain of his fate, loves not his wronger. But, oh, what damned minutes tells he dotes, yet doubts, suspects, yet strongly loves." So he's said that he's used a metaphor, again with a bit of kind of almost supernatural imagery here. "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster." So again, the verb, we look at the verb, the noun is doing something that it can't actually do. Or in this case, jealousy is not literally a green-eyed monster. But here it creates excellent imagery that is, again, ironic because Iago is almost talking to himself and the audience about his own envy, while indicating to Othello that is going to be equally his own downfall. So Shakespeare's littered with metaphors. What's so effective about this? Okay, obviously beautifully written, but also the metaphor. Sorry, I don't usually have this much in my throat. It is 7 o'clock in the morning, so just bear with me a second. There we go. When we look at monstrous imagery, okay, which is a very, very common motif when we look at something we want to denounce, particularly from this period, okay, we would have descriptions of monsters or creatures from the deep that you best not go near, to be able to alienate the reader from that emotion, from that event. Okay, if you want to scare somebody off from doing something, saying that it's a monster is an awfully good way of doing it. So kind of like we're children, right? Don't look under your bed, kids, at night. There's monsters underneath there. Okay, you're not gonna, when you're 8, you're too terrified to look under your bed if there's a monster there. So the idea with this section is that, putting the dramatic irony aside, Shakespeare's actually warning the audience, hey, be careful of envy. Envy is the key reason why absolutely everybody in this play is going to experience a downfall. So the really key point here is that metaphor actually highlights and indicates to the reader what the key didactic purpose of the text can be. Didacticism being the moral of the story. Now, some postmodern writers and other writers from different time periods don't like didacticism, or they don't think that, stories should have inherent moral purpose. That's totally fine. But if you are a writer that wants to write with a moral purpose or some sort of ethical teaching, like a lot of Shakespeare's work or Chaucer or anybody else that's a bit more classical, just remember metaphors can actually emphasize that key aspect of morality, because your brain's going to latch onto it. It's going to reconceptualize what that vice or what that problem is and reframe it in the way you've commanded them to reframe it. In this case, like a monster. Very effective. Okay, moving on to The Colossus by Sylvia Plath. This is a lovely long poem. I've only used 2 sections here to highlight metaphor, but please do go and read the whole thing. It's absolutely stunning and beautiful. Now, Plath is, again, very, very different time period. So if we look, we've gone Emily Dickinson, which is transatlantic American kind of Enlightenment period. And then you've got Shakespeare, early modern England. And now we've got Sylvia Plath in the 1950s in America. So metaphor has spanned across all good writing in lots of time periods, irrespective of what other writers might be using, because they're so effective. Now, Plath uses metaphor in a very, very psychological way. A lot of her poetry is very psychological anyway, right? She's a bit iconically known for that, which is always beautiful. We're going to read these 2 stanzas here, and we're going to have a look again. She's going to combine it with animal imagery, but she also combines it with a lot of sensory imagery. I think I mentioned before the tactility of metaphor. So you'll be able to learn, if you combine a metaphor with something like animal imagery or with sensory imagery, right, describing the senses, tactile, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, which is taste, visual, which is sight. If you combine metaphor with sensory imagery, it makes it incredibly powerful, because, again, it's like you're throwing the reader into the senses and the experiences of the persona. Okay? And if you're writing a story or narrative that's a lot longer, then you're still doing the same thing. It would just take a longer time period to put that in there. So, The Colossus. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. We'll pause on that section there. So here you'll see she's also used a thing called cumulative listing. So it's where you put lots of descriptions right next to each other. Okay, so it's usually when there's lots of commas. So you got pieced, glued, properly jointed. So you're getting this compounded imagery. Now, can you actually glue someone together, or glue an understanding of a person's personality together? No, right? We can't literally do that. Okay, so that means, answer that question, we must be facing some sort of metaphor, some sort of figurative imagery. We then have, and this is something that Shakespeare and Dickinson kind of didn't do because they're not modernist, but you'll see modernists tend to take out the verbs. Okay, so she hasn't gone, you are mule, you're a mule bro, you make pig grunts, you make bawdy cackles, and this all proceeds from your lips. Okay. She hasn't put the verbs in there, because usually it's the noun doing something the noun can't do, okay, the verb. But she's kind of taken that verb out, and she's just gone through straight with adjectives to describe what this person is, but you can't literally be. So, can you make pig grunts? Okay, yes, Probably some humans can do that one, but again, it's a bit hyperbolic. Okay, hyperbole meaning an extreme description of something. Hyperboles are everywhere, and they usually are combined with metaphor. So if I say, oh, let's say I'm running late for work, which never happens, not whatsoever at all. But if I said, oh, there was thousands of cars in the street today, the traffic was chock-a-block, it was just completely filled with millions of trucks. Okay. There's not literally millions of trucks in front of me, so there is a bit of a metaphorical aspect to that. But I've also used an extreme example of something to prove a point. Okay, so hyperboles combined with metaphor tend to be very persuasive. While sensory imagery kind of places you in the persona's perspective, hyperbole kind of persuades you on whatever the perspective might be. So if we're having a look here, pink grunt, it's like you're in a barnyard. Okay, well, it's worse than a barnyard. All of a sudden, we're greeted by a very extreme or extravagant description of somebody. Now, whether that's good or bad or positive, negative, that's obviously going to be directed throughout the poem. But we're immediately introduced, this is the first part of the poem, we're immediately introduced with a persona who's tackling somebody who obviously they might not immediately get on with. Hyperbole, therefore, can act as a persuasive technique, but also engage the reader with your key points or your key characters. Okay, because if somebody hyperbolizes something, you tend to pay attention to it. Okay, oh, there's millions of cars out on the road today. You'd immediately go, oh, Charlotte's being extravagant, but I've just made people pay attention to me. Right. So usually slightly narcissistic people like a good hyperbole because it's going to make everybody focus on what they're saying. Okay. So actually, I once had this lecturer do this great outline of the Odyssey. This is not a very popular reading of it, so caveat. But the Odysseus was just a narcissistic drunk dude coming back from the Trojan War to home and just kept getting lost on a boat. And so when he got back to Penelope, he was trying to just like explain away why he'd gone for so long. So instead of taking a nap in some sheep, or with a shepherd, he was like, oh, it was a cyclops and I had to battle my way out of it, right? But the way the lecturer made jokes about that was the fact that Odysseus is doing hyperboles, right? He's doing extravagant hyperboles with metaphors in there to make everybody pay attention to him and also to persuade everyone around him that he wasn't doing anything naughty on his trip, like getting trapped by a nymph, okay, for 7 years. So, okay, caveat, obviously that's not how we read the Odyssey, but it's an interesting and very funny way of remembering how powerful hyperbole and metaphor can be when trying to argue a point, okay? So if we look at this second section, in their old anarchy to the horizon line, it would take more than a lightning stroke to create such a ruin. Nights I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear, out of the wind. Now, there's a lot in that last line. So I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear. Okay, so I've got a photo of an image of a cornucopia on the side there. Now, can you literally have a cornucopia in your left ear? No, okay. However, it's giving a very, very, again, sensory imagery. You've got, it's like the person's, okay, literally sitting in the ear. What's the ear symbolic of? Okay, listening, communicating to each other. She's wanting to sit or find safety out of the wind. Okay, so find safety out of the wind in somebody who's going to listen to her. Okay, and in this, it kind of indicates that it's nature or nights, okay, like the nighttime. So do night times have ears, and do these ears have cornucopias in them? No, we've got 3 separate metaphors in literally like not even a full sentence. So you'll see a lot of the magic that underlies really evocative imagery in poetry and in writing in general tends to reside in how they're combining metaphor with other techniques. So you've got this base metaphor, but then you're adding things like there's a bit of personification. So personification is a type of metaphor. It's where you're using a human attribute to describe something that it can't literally do. Can knights have an ear? No. Okay, cool. So it is a type of metaphor, but it's personification because it's got a human attribute to it. I squat in the cornucopia. Okay, that's definitely a metaphor, because you can't squat in a cornucopia in someone's ear. Okay, so the amount of, and you've also got, I mean, if we're going to really compound it, you've got natural imagery in there as well, because you've got the wind. Okay, what's the symbolism of the wind? The wind is symbolic of, hardship, or some sort of suffering, or something that you want to stay away from. Okay, wind can be positive, but in this context, and in most contexts, it's usually something that you need to brace against. So what you'll notice, and this is a really important thing when it comes to writing that I think academia tends to forget, is that we over intellectualize a lot of techniques. I know I've been rambling on about certain techniques throughout the session, but when you think about it, that symbolic leap I've made there of the wind meaning something that you need to brace against, that's not based off kind of some book that I read or some thing that somebody taught me. That's an intrinsic experience that we've all shared at some point. Oh, the wind's really strong and it's coming against us. Okay, let's brace. So what the writer's done is they've taken that common experience that we've all had, and then they've used a metaphor to connect it to a different reality. Okay, so then you're kind of combining these two realities. Is this emotive experience that you've had in a vision of your kind of psychology of the way you've experienced the world, and then you're combining it with a base reality that you've described in your story. Okay, and so that bridge between reality and what could be, or what you're feeling, or what you have felt in the past, is actually completely predicated. It's completely based on what we all feel, something that we've all kind of felt or we've experienced. I'm sure you've probably had that before, where you've read a poem and you've been like, oh my God, this is amazing. I wish I could write like this. This is exactly how I feel. Okay. And then somebody else has read that poem and been like, oh, I don't know, it didn't really do anything for me. Okay. It didn't affect me. It's probably because, it might be because, I should put a bit of a stronger caveat in there, but it might be because that other person hasn't actually experienced what the poet is describing. Okay, so I'll give a very, very basic example. Say we're talking about something like the wind. Okay, in certain parts of Australia, we don't get strong winds, we get horrible sun. Okay, we get terrible sunburns just from walking outside in 48-degree heat. If somebody who lived in that circumstance for most of their life and never saw snow, if they read a poem about snow, they could maybe try to imagine it and they could really love it, but they're not going to have that sensory experience that maybe somebody who lived in the Arctic Circle would have, because they're going to be able to imagine and connect with that in a very different way. I'm not saying it's a better way, I'm just saying it's a different way. So we can think about that in all sorts of life circumstances. The way that, say, somebody who endured World War II, maybe they were in one of the battles, or maybe they, were part of the army, the way they're going to read a military text or some sort of anti-war narrative would probably be very different to, say, somebody like me, who thankfully has never had to endure that. That doesn't mean I can't experience it and appreciate it from a metaphorical perspective. I can go, oh, okay, let's say Lord of the Rings, right? If I'm reading Lord of the Rings as a kind of reflection of Tolkien's time in the army, I might be able to go, gosh, what amazing bravery, what amazing courage. But somebody that's watched kind of Gandalf, they've gone, oh yeah, I had a commanding general like that. Right. Or I had a friend that I lost, and he was just like Frodo. He kind of bore too much weight in the world. So metaphors are also highly predicated on context. So sometimes what happens is certain metaphors will work differently for different people, and that's what is actually the magic of them. One of the reasons why Shakespeare is so popular so many hundreds of years later is because his metaphors give so much meaning to lots of different people. Okay, the way one person might read a metaphor in Shakespeare might be completely different to somebody else, because maybe one was in the 1750s in Scotland, the other one was in Russia in the 1960s. There's no particular correct way of reading metaphors a lot of the time. It's just completely based on assumptions we're making depending on our historical or political or social experiences. So Metaphors are far more complicated than we think they are, but they're also so much simpler as well. When you as a writer are thinking about how to create different images together, and if you give your writing to somebody and it's got, say here, nights I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear out of the wind. Let's pretend you wrote that brilliant line. And you give it to somebody that's never experienced wind. Obviously they have, but bear with me. Let's say you give it to somebody that's not experienced wind. They might go, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't really, like, I love this bit, but I don't really get this section. Okay. What are you trying to say here? I don't get why that image is there. As soon as somebody's not getting something and you've written a metaphor, it's probably because either you haven't used the right verb, you haven't connected the noun to that other description, that reality to the dream world properly, or more likely, maybe there's a bit of context you haven't told them about what the wind is in the poem. Maybe you need to explain what the wind is earlier in the poem so that when you use that metaphor later, it makes sense. Edgar Allan Poe's quite good at that. So when he's using natural or kind of weather-based imagery, it's called pathetic fallacy. If you want the fancy term, pathetic fallacies, when you use weather to describe emotions or feelings that are resembling the rain, the sun, whatever weather you've got. He's very, very good at foreshadowing what that weather's going to symbolize later in the text. So if you have somebody read your poetry and go, oh, I don't know, I don't really get this bit of imagery, I don't get this metaphor, it just means either we need to make the connection clearer, or you need to go up earlier in the poem and you need to foreshadow what that event is, what that experience is, and how it might actually impact the persona later. So if I said earlier in this poem, the wind is brisk and abhorrent, okay? Abhorrent's quite a high modality word, but if I said the wind is brisk and abhorrent, that means later on when I said out of the wind, the person's going to be able to go, oh yes, okay, wind means something that's negative, okay? We all have monkey brains, so we need to be able to help people make leapfrogs through how we've experienced things. So obviously with wind, it's a very easy example, but maybe you're writing about something that's really complicated. Okay, maybe you're writing about something like divorce, okay, or family problems, or more geopolitical issues from different historical time periods. Whatever it is, it's a lot more complex. You just have to think, how can I, if I'm going to use a significant metaphor and it's going to matter a lot about what that, like how people interpret that metaphor, make sure you've done the work beforehand to make sure there's enough context. Shakespeare, when he said the green-eyed monster, doesn't matter what time period you're from, we all have that shared assumption that monsters are bad. Okay, that's why when I read that metaphor now, and when that metaphor was written 500 years ago, everybody had the same understanding of it, because the imagery itself is very, very basic and preliminary. It's almost animalistic, like it's almost primal. That's the other thing. Shakespeare, Dickinson, all these great writers, we tend to think that they do, amazing magic tricks with their literary devices, and they do, but a lot of the time they're actually using really simple stuff. Okay, they're not saying jealousy is this deep political issue, and I'm going to use an analogy to a remote part of, Czechoslovakia in a random time period, right, as a metaphor. Yes, that was very random. That's my point, right? They're not going to use something very niche. They're going to use a green-eyed monster. Okay, when we look at, again, I'm going to use Odysseus since it's so popular at the moment. If we hear a cyclops, this big creature with one eye that's got kind of usually depicted with a bit of a club foot, we're all going to immediately go, oh, we're not necessarily safe. This is probably something a bit dangerous, because it's an assumption we hold. You might want to break that assumption. You might want to make the cyclops the hero of the story and the kindest person in all the world. That's awesome. But you've got to understand what the assumptions of the audience are, because the assumptions are going to dictate how they interpret your metaphor, how they interpret your allusions and your references. It doesn't mean a constricting point. It just means we need to know what we're working with, right? And as soon as you know what you're working with, it makes life a lot easier. So how to identify a metaphor? We've been talking about that as we've been going through. Just ask yourself, can the verb literally do the action word that it is claiming to do? We use metaphors all the time in English. That's what makes English so difficult as English as a second language, okay? We use metaphors left, right, and center. At no point am I literally hopping on a bus or jumping on a train, Okay, we're not literally doing these things. They're metaphors. That's why when you learn, if your English is your first language and you're learning another language as your second, you usually get into these moments of going, oh, hang on, I can't literally translate what I'm going to say, otherwise it'll sound bad. I distinctly remember when I was learning French that I told one of my friends that I was going to hop on, what was it? Yeah, I was going to hop on a train, and then after that, I was going to jump onto the ferry. And they looked at me, they knew what I meant, but they looked at me with a bit of confusion, being like, that's not how we say that here. And I was like, oh, hang on, okay. The verbs in different languages, they're usually a lot stricter. And that's beautiful as well. Every language has its own little magic keys that make it beautiful and make it poetic. And English, one of the things that makes it so fun and rich as a language is that it is laden with metaphors. And it also means you can do what you like with them as well. Metaphors, that's very, very easy to do because we have so many different verbs. Okay? And any language with a lot of, or even a minority amount of verbs in a language will still do the trick, but English has so many, we actually don't have an excuse not to be able to use them. So, as I said here, the magic of metaphor is in the verb. So identify the verb and play around with what it can and can't literally do. Once you start swapping out different verbs, you will be able to play with reality. Jack flew through the wind to reach Jill. Okay. Can Jack fly? No, not literally. Okay. But it gives very, very different imagery to saying Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack and Jill came down the hill, la-di-da-di-da. Jack caught the breeze in the palm of his hand. Okay. Now, yeah, okay, we can go like that. We have that image in our head, right? Someone trying to catch wind, but we can't literally really catch wind. That's a bit of, again, a bit hyperbolic. So tactile imagery, but it's giving this really all-encompassing description of the character engaging with the natural landscape. Really small phrase. You get the idea. So when you're writing and you're trying to practice metaphor, one of the things you can do is just literally start changing verbs around. Sometimes it's going to look funny, right? So Jack hopscotched through the wind, or on top of the wings of the wind, right? It might look a little bit silly sometimes, and that's okay. The idea is you're playing around with it, and that's the best way to learn and feel confident. So how to write a metaphor. Stephen King stated that metaphors enable a reader to see the old thing in a new and vivid way. Okay, so like we were saying before, it allows for a different perception of reality. A short story is a different thing altogether. A short story is like a quick kiss in the dark from a stranger. Now, this is an example of how you can get really good and confident writing metaphors quickly. So there's a thing called a simile, and a simile just means when something is like another. So the sky is like the ocean, right? A simile is part of figurative language. You're doing a very similar thing. You're saying, hey, this thing is like this other abstract concept, and I'm trying to create a relationship between these two concepts, between reality and the imagined. Okay. If you do this little cheeky thing and you just write your simile and then take out the word like or as, you'll have a metaphor. So a short story is a quick kiss in the dark from a stranger. Okay, so it's very, okay, maybe not the easiest way to do it all the time, but if you're trying to practice it and get into the habit of doing metaphors and you're going, oh, hang on, I'm stumbling over these words, just write a simile first, because it's like a little building block. It's like training wheels. Okay, and similes are great as well. If you like the simile and you put it there, you're like, excellent, great, keep it, awesome. But if you're wanting to practice metaphors, just write a simile. So the sea is like the sky, and then you're going to go, the sea is the sky, and then you go on with your description. So, or like if Shakespeare, not that Shakespeare would ever need to practice, but if he was, he'd go, jealousy is like a green-eyed monster. Take out the like. Jealousy is a green-eyed monster. Okay, so it's a really, really effective way of practicing. Now, extended metaphors, which I said I'd cover a little bit earlier. There is a reason there's a toothbrush here. Don't worry, it's not an error. I will get onto it in a second. So extended metaphors reinforce the imagery surrounding the vision of reality you're wishing to portray within the text. Remember, brains love pattern recognition. Okay, so if you extend the metaphor throughout the passage, or maybe you turn it into a motif and it's going throughout the whole text, You're enabling the reader to predict what's going to happen. And we all have a lot of satisfaction in that. Agatha Christie nails that. Okay. Any good murder mystery or kind of crime writer is very, very good at balancing predictability with a little bit of secrecy. Okay, because we all love when we're, reading an Agatha Christie or watching a great version, the David Suchet version of Poirot, whatever we're watching. We love when we're sitting there and we go, oh my God, I thought it was them. Or, oh my God, that makes so much sense. It was them that did that. Okay. That's because they've usually put a little motif or little hints earlier on as to what is about to happen or what's going to happen. You'll also notice in Harry Potter, if you're one of the kids that loved Harry Potter as when you were younger, or you're an adult and you love Harry Potter, I think J.K. Rowling uses the word foreboding some ridiculous amount of times, which is great. She's getting the point across. Harry felt a sense of foreboding. Something bad is going to happen. So then when something bad happens, even though you might be a little bit shocked by it, your brain is actually predicting it. And so you have a lot more enjoyment from the text. So when you do metaphors and you start to make them almost predictable, say Beauty and the Beast, you've got the rose, which is a motif symbolic of, transformation and love and everything like that. Yes, we're using a Disney analogy here, but bear with me, it's a very good one. Any sort of sentences around the rose that are metaphorical, it's going to help the brain, again, do that aspect of pattern recognition. So when I put a blue toothbrush here, you'll notice that every other slide I did had kind of ancient Greek imagery. Okay, why did I pick that? Because it's cool. Like, a lot of ancient Greek writers used metaphor. So I thought, okay, cool, I'll put some ancient Greek imagery to make it look cool and funky. All right. But the toothbrush, as soon as we got to this slide, your brain probably went, why is there a toothbrush there? That makes no sense, right? And it doesn't. But that's the point that we're trying to make, is that as soon as you have something that's inconsistent in your story, so say if you're using imagery of or metaphors of the wind to demonstrate something destructive, and then all of a sudden you use it to describe something really beautiful, it can be confusing in a good way. Maybe you've done it on purpose and you've made it very engaging, but you could also confuse the living daylights out of your reader, and they might start to lose track. They might go, hang on, I thought this bit of imagery was supposed to symbolize something different. Now I'm lost. Okay. So good writers will be able to shift extended metaphors or imagery in different ways. Okay, make them positive or negative throughout the piece, but that's something that we need to practice. Okay, so if I wanted to foreshadow putting a toothbrush in, I'd probably want to begin the series by this whole little chat that we're having with something about keeping the mouth clean of similes, clean of vulgarisms, clean of dull descriptions, right? We're going to clean our mouths of all dull linguistic uses of basic imagery. Okay, we're going to use really expressive and engaging metaphor. Okay, and then if I kept using the mouth or teeth or tongue or anything like that throughout the piece, and then maybe I, used the word toothbrush a few times, by the time we got to this slide, even though the imagery is very different, the coloring's quite different to what I used previously, it wouldn't be a complete shock to the system. Okay, so that's the other thing that I want to put forward here. Extended metaphors or any type of metaphor can be a great act of foreshadowing, because metaphors can kind of go under the radar, right? You can have the imagery of Iago as a monster early on in the piece, and then at the end, he acts completely monstrously and is described as a demi-devil, which I would say within the Shakespearean time period, that's kind of the epitome of a monster. Okay, so you can use metaphors as foreshadowing to create that sense of predictability, but in a subtle way, rather than, God bless J.K. Rowling, but rather than just saying Harry's got a sense of foreboding, you could actually use a metaphor to maybe describe his experiences or his emotions, which then foreshadow the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone or the Chamber of Secrets or whatever it is. Okay, I'm sure she did do that somewhere and I'm missing it because I read it when I was very, very young, but you get the idea. Good writers will usually use a lot of metaphor to create foreshadowing, which we love. So metaphors keep people in the dream of truth you are painting by the way of describing reality as something it is literally not, but figuratively is. Okay, so I love the typos in this. That's beautiful. Thank you for bearing with me on that one. But again, the metaphors, the whole point, okay, is that you're suspending reality slightly to put emphasis on something else, on whatever you're creating the reference or allusion to. If you're creating a reference to the wind, to the monster, you're putting the reality of the situation and suspending it, holding it up in a dream state in something that it's not. And when as soon as you say something is something that it's not, then you're falling into this use of figurative language that great writers have always used. It's a wonderful tradition. Every culture, every country, every writer in these countries have a long tradition of using different figurative forms and languages. So it's my way of saying very well approved, okay, by lots of different people. So definitely play around with it whenever you're wanting to create better imagery and better engagement. And again, if you find that if you ever get feedback from critics or from readers or anything and they're getting confused at any point of your imagery, you've probably mucked up your metaphors. Okay, so make sure to do that foreshadowing thing we mentioned. Describe that metaphor in detail, subtly earlier on. What does the reader need to know about elements of that metaphor for it to make sense later in the piece? And then make sure your verbs are good and almost not, I don't want to say comical, but again, sometimes they can be a bit too far-fetched, okay? You want to do subtle and engaged ones, not too outlandish. If you do outlandish, that's okay, but that means your whole piece needs to be a bit outlandish. That discussion kind of falls more under genre theory, so we can do that another time. Genres kind of create the boundaries of a reality you might be describing. Okay, so that, from my memory, these are my references. Yes, so here I put 2 books at the end here. Metaphors We Live By is really awesome. I think it was one of the first things they kind of give you at uni. They kind of throw that at you. And then I've popped 2 links to the psychology stuff that I mentioned as well, if you want to check them out. But yeah, that's our metaphors. So let me quickly hop out of there and let me see if that works. So that is metaphors. Thank you so much for joining and for engaging. I really appreciate it. If you want any other sort of theme or form or technique discussed, please let me know. I'm looking forward to going through them. I think the next thing I might do is genre, because understanding genre makes a massive difference to your capacity to use different techniques and engage in different ways with different art forms. So we'll have a go at that, and have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining.